Welcome to On the Way Classroom with Tony Crisp. Each weekday, Monday through Friday, Dr. Crisp will teach the Bible from its historical, geographical, linguistic, and cultural context. Tune in daily to start your day right and to deepen your understanding of how to better walk the way and enjoy the journey. Now, here's your host, Dr. Tony Crisp.
Welcome to On the Way Classroom. Today we're in a title shift. Today we're in Acts chapter 10 in our journey through the early church and its history. And in Acts chapter 10, we are going to go where no man had ever gone before as far as salvation history. And God is going to open up salvation to the Gentile just as the Jew. That's right. We are going to, in Acts chapter 10, see how God called the first Gentile to be saved, and his name was Cornelius. And he was a centurion, he was a soldier. Isn't it amazing that when God wanted to save and redeem the first Gentile into the church of Jesus, he chose a Roman soldier? Well, let's pick up on the narrative. There was a certain man in Caesarea. Now, this is Caesarea by the sea, called Caesarea Maritime. And as you read through the New Testament, sometimes it can get confusing. When you read through the Gospels, for instance, in Matthew chapter 16, you read where Jesus and his disciples left the Sea of Galilee, which is 700 feet below sea level, and in the summertime, it is unbelievably hot. Now, many of you who are listening to me have been to Disney World in the summertime, let's just say July, and it is 95 degrees as far as the thermometer, but it is 95 degrees as far as humidity. And you think, okay, I cannot bear this. This is unbearable because when the sun goes down at midnight, you have a cool wave comes through and it gets down to about 90 instead of 95. Well, now that's the way it is around the Sea of Galilee. The Sea of Galilee, Lake Kinneret, is a freshwater lake, which is the lowest freshwater lake on the planet, 700 feet below the level of the Mediterranean. And why is that important? Because of the conditions that we read about in the Gospels. Wind, it's like a wind tunnel. It's in that great Syrian-African rift. So winds come from off the desert, they come from off the Mediterranean, and they many times will meet at this beautiful lake, and the wind will sometimes raise the waves on what is otherwise placid lake, very still lake, up to 13 to 15 feet waves on a lake that's only 7.5 miles wide and 14 miles long. But Mount Arbel, 3 years ago in August, I was there with a wonderful group of men. There were just 8 or 9 of us. And we were up on top of Mount Arbel at the end of August, 1st of September, and it was 115 degrees. So no doubt, Jesus and his disciples would have gone north as we did, where it's cooler. And that area in the north was dominated by a city called Caesarea Philippi. And it was built by Philip, who was one of the sons of Herod the Great. And he built a city and called it Caesarea after Augustus, just as his father had built Caesarea in honor of Augustus on the coast of the Mediterranean. Now, many of you have been there because the great theater is still there. The Hippodrome has been uncovered. That was the capital of Judea during the days of Jesus. We read about Caesarea by the sea. It was a great fortress that was there, and the harbor that Herod the Great had built was second to none. It was absolutely fascinating, and it's a beautiful place to go and to study. And this is where we find Cornelius. Now, the Bible describes him in a particular way. Now, there was a certain man in Caesarea called Cornelius. He was a centurion of what was called the Italian regiment. He was a devout man and one who feared God. Now that's very important. That's not just another phrase of description of this man. This was a definitive phrase. He was a God-fearer. Now that was a group of people that were non-Jews, but they feared the God of the Jews. In other words, they respected the God of the Jews and gave him his rightful place. They were not followers in the sense of devout and devoted in the sense of a proselyte. They had never been circumcised and baptized, and they had never taken on a rabbi and become a Talmud, a disciple. But yet they feared God and they prayed to him on a regular basis, no doubt 3 times a day, like those who were devout Jews. And so he was a devout one. He was a God-fearer with all his household, and he gave alms generously to the people and prayed to God always. Now, this is fascinating to me because I have shared with you over and over again that the Bible is a Jewish book. It's written by Jews, to Jews, primarily for Jews. And when you understand that, this passage makes sense and you get the real sense of the passage. You see, since the Bible was written by Jews and primarily to Jews and for Jews, even this part, which was written by a Gentile, but he was the protege of a Jewish man, a preacher, a teacher, an apostle named Saul of Tarsus, the Apostle Paul. Luke was the one that was the personal physician of the Apostle Paul, and so he had a Jewish perspective, even though he's the only Gentile writer. And remember, every writer of the Bible, everyone that God chose to write sacred scriptures, believed, assumed, everyone from Moses to John, that the people to whom they were writing understood the context. They understood the history, the geography, the geopolitical situation, and the cultural customs of the day. And so indeed, he was a God-fearer and he was good to the people. That's what it says. He gave alms to the people. Well, who were the people that he's talking about? He's talking about Jews. There were Jews in this Caesarea. And as a matter of fact, there were a lot of Jews there. I could give you the history of Caesarea for the first 300 years after Saul wrote, but this is where an event took place here that gave rise to the Great Revolt in 67. And so there were a lot of Jews here. They were religious Jews, and they were here in this capital of the Romans where Herod the Great had set up this great seaport. And so when he says he gave alms generously to the people, he was talking about the Jewish people, not the Roman soldiers and the people that were there. But what was odd and particular about this is because he gave alms to the Jews. And also the scripture says that he prayed always. And about the 9th hour, why is that important? Because that's the hour of prayer. They prayed at the 3rd hour. They would pray at noon. They would pray at 3 o'clock. These were times of the sacrifices at the temple. The 3rd hour, which would have been 9 o'clock, and then the 9th hour, which would have been 3 in the afternoon. And it says that about the 9th hour of the day, he saw clearly a vision of the angel of the Lord coming in and saying to him, Cornelius. And when he observed him, he was afraid and said, Who is it, Lord? And he said unto him, Your prayers and your alms have come up before me as a memorial before God. Now, what were the 2 things that caused God to come to Cornelius? It was that he was praying to God and he was giving to the Jewish people. He was praying to the God of the Jews and he was being kind to the Jewish people. And that stood out. If he had been kind to the Romans, nothing there. No, he's talking about the Jewish people. And when Peter is recounting this as to why he will come later in this chapter that we'll study in the next session, you will find out that Peter said, listen, the reason an angel was sent to me is because your generosity to the people, to the Jewish people, and your prayers were heard by God. And this gives many of my friends trouble because they want to say, well, God does what he does because of who he is, and there are no conditions to it. There's no means to it whatsoever. Let me just tell you, the God who has ordained who is going to be saved also ordains the means whereby they will be saved. And God, in his supernatural omniscience, knows who's going to be saved, yes. But according to this, I didn't make this up. It says that when the angel, the messenger of God, came to Cornelius, when the Lord spoke, he said, "What is it, Lord?" And he said, listen to this, "Your prayers and your alms have come up as a memorial, something to be remembered before God." God said, the reason I'm coming is because you prayed. The reason I'm coming to you is because I saw what you have done to my people. Now, like it or not, that's what God says. And I know some of you right now are going, oh, no, he's saying it's all because. No, I'm not saying anything. I'm saying what the Bible says. And so it says, now, send men to Joppa. This is what the angel said unto Cornelius. And send for Simon, whose surname is Peter. You see, Peter's name was Simon Bar-Jonah. Simon, John's son. And so his name was Simon Johnson. That's the way we would say it today. But he was called Peter, Petros. He got that name in Caesarea Philippi, which I just spoke of, in the northern part of Israel, the cooler part of Israel, the more mountainous part of Israel, that is in the north. And he got that when he answered correctly who Jesus is, and he said, "You are Petros." That's a movable stone. Now, in Aramaic, that's the same word, same name for stone for Petros is Cephas. And so we see that in some of the Gospels. And so this Simon was called the rock, Petros. He is lodging with Simon, another Simon, who is a tanner, whose house is by the sea. He will tell you what you must do. And when the angel who spoke to him had departed, Cornelius called two of his household servants and a devout soldier from among those who waited on him continually. So when he had explained all the things to them, he sent them to Joppa. Now, can you imagine what that was like for these people who had watched Cornelius over the years? More and more he became a God-fearer and devout, and he prayed on a regular basis, and today he called in those who had been tending to him and his assistants for all of these years, and he said, "Now an angel just appeared unto me." Well, that shouldn't have been a shock to them because you don't hear any talk back. No, and he said, "Here's what I'm going to tell you. Here's what's happened, and I want you to go because I have been asked to send to Joppa, and I'm going to send you there, and you need to bring back this guy named Simon, but he goes by Peter. And you go to this house, and it's Simon the tanner. He'll be down by the seashore because he is a tanner, and that's where he lives, and you will say to Peter just what I'm going to tell you." And in our next session, we're going to pick up on this story, and it is fascinating, and we're going to learn what many of you have not ever known, that Peter was a religious Jew. That's right. I hear all the time that the disciples were not religious people and Jesus wasn't a religious person. And the reason is we've got our minds on the people like Saul of Tarsus and the elite Jews and priests that rejected Jesus, as that's the only way that you can be religious. That's not so. Because religio is just a binding to a routine. And if you are a follower of Jesus, you should have some good routines that lead to godliness, rituals that lead us to godliness. Hopefully you have a ritual of reading the Bible every day. Hopefully you have a ritual, a religiosity, religiously, of praying and of giving thanks and of living a certain way and thinking a certain way. That's religion. You might not like that, but it doesn't matter. It's the truth. And in the next session, we're going to learn about Peter, who was a religious Jew along with the other of the disciples. in our next On the Way classroom.
Thanks for listening to On the Way Classroom with Dr. Tony Crisp. Tune in each weekday for more information on how to read, study, and understand the Bible. If you have questions, please write to questions@tonycrisp.org. That's questions@tonycrisp.org. questions@tonycrisp.org. Thanks for listening and have a blessed day on the way.